There are stories buried in the red dust of Africa that the world has never dared to tell, stories that whisper across the centuries like a breath of fire, stories that remind us that the memory of a people cannot be erased, only forgotten for a time. Among these are the stories of the Igbo of Nigeria and the Ethiopians of the Horn, two ancient peoples separated by mountains and deserts, yet bound by a mystery that has puzzled historians, theologians, and anthropologists alike. The claim that both share Israelite roots is not a myth of convenience, nor a fantasy born from longing. It is a reflection of ancestral memory, of signs and customs, of language and faith that reach back into the dawn of human civilization. The world may dismiss it as coincidence, but within the hearts of these two nations lies a truth too deep to be silenced. To understand this mystery, one must first remember that Africa is not a land of tribes alone. It is a continent of kingdoms, priests, and scholars, a continent that has preserved the sacred threads of humanity's oldest stories. Long before maps divided it, Africa held within its breast the footprints of migration, exile, and divine promise. When we trace the lineages of the Igbo and the Ethiopians, we find that their memories echo with symbols older than any empire, a covenant, a code, and a rhythm of life that mirrors the traditions of the ancient Hebrew. From the Igbo, reverence for the sacred name Chukwu, the Almighty Creator, to the Ethiopian claim of Solomonic descent through the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon, the connection between these peoples and the Israelites grows more profound with every discovery. The Igbo tell tales of ancestors who crossed rivers guided by divine light, of names and rituals that mirror those of ancient Israel, circumcision on the 8th day, purification after childbirth, and the celebration of rest days that align with Sabbath rhythm. Their elders speak of Eri, a patriarch who came from the east, who settled near the confluence of the Niger and Anambra rivers, and who taught his descendants to live by laws of purity and brotherhood. In those stories, the east is not just a direction, it is a memory of migration, of exile, of return. These tales are not isolated. Across Ethiopia, the story is carried in the ancient city of Aksum, where the Ark of the Covenant is said to rest in guarded silence. Ethiopian priests in the highlands chant psalms in Ge'ez, a language so ancient it predates Latin and Greek, a language whose script is cousin to Hebrew. Their liturgy, their dietary codes, and their festivals all mirror the ancient traditions of Israel. To the untrained eye, these parallels might appear as cultural coincidences, but history rarely speaks in coincidence, it speaks in patterns. It tells us that migration is as old as breath, that faith travels with those who remember. When the northern tribes of Israel were scattered by Assyrian conquest, many were lost to history. But what if some were not lost, only reborn under new sun? The Igbo, settled in the forests of West Africa, and the Ethiopians in their mountain citadels, may both carry echoes of that lost journey, not in name alone but in custom, law, and ancestral spirit. This idea does not diminish their Africanness, it deepens it, for it reminds us that Africa has always been the cradle of continuity, where the sacred and the historical merge. The British colonizers once mocked the Igbo for claiming descent from Israel. They called it arrogance, delusion, a fantasy of the enslaved. But what they could not understand was that the Igbo never needed permission to know who they were. They did not seek validation from the empires that enslaved them. They carried their truth in their blood. When the Bible spoke of exile, bondage, and deliverance, the Igbo did not hear a foreign story, they heard their own. Likewise, Ethiopia stood apart as the only African nation never colonized, a land that held fast to its ancient faith through centuries of turmoil. The bond between Igbo and Ethiopian consciousness is not political but spiritual, a shared instinct that freedom and faith cannot be given or taught, only remembered. When the world speaks of the lost tribes of Israel, it imagines mystery, people who vanished into history without a trace. Yet Africa may hold the answer. The very customs of the Igbo reveal fragments of ancient law. The division of the week into 4 market days mirrors the Hebrew lunar observances. The use of the word Elohim in some old Igbo dialects, the presence of names like Eri, Gad, Levi, names that also appear among the tribes of Israel. Scholars may debate their origins, but the people themselves know it in their bones. They know that truth can live in oral memory longer than in written scripture. Ethiopia too carries this ancestral code. The ancient Kebra Nagast, the glory of kings, tells of how the Queen of Sheba bore Solomon's son Menelik I, who carried the ark to Ethiopia. For centuries, Ethiopia's emperors claimed descent from David's line. The Beta Israel, the Ethiopian Jews, preserved their Torah traditions even through persecution. In the mountains hidden from the world, they kept the Sabbath, circumcised their sons, and read from scrolls long before contact with European Judaism. They did not learn these ways, they remembered them. That is what binds Ethiopia and Igbo together, remembrance. A remembrance that says we are not lost. We were scattered, but we never disappeared. Some will argue that the resemblance is symbolic, not genetic. But even if it were only symbolic, symbols have power. They connect generations through meaning. The Igbo and Ethiopians are teaching us that identity is not about proof. It is about truth. When a people can see themselves reflected in an ancient story of struggle, faith, and liberation, that reflection gives them strength to rise again. The colonizers sought to break that memory to replace ancestral identity with foreign dogma. Yet no matter how many chains were forged, the spirit of remembrance endured. The Igbo sang it in their war songs of Biafra, and the Ethiopians carried it in their victory at Adwa. Both declared in their own voices, "We are not children of defeat, we are heirs of an eternal covenant." What makes this story powerful is not the claim itself, but what it reveals about human endurance. The idea that the Igbo and Ethiopians are connected to ancient Israel speaks to a deeper truth, that people everywhere have always sought the divine thread that ties them to creation. For Africa, that thread was never broken. It lived in Nsibidi symbols carved into the walls, in the sound of drums that marked sacred festivals, in the songs of griots, who carried memory across centuries. It lived in the Igbo markets, where trade was not just commerce but covenant. It lived in the Ethiopian highlands, where priests guarded relics with their lives. The world feared Africa because Africa remembered. A people who remember who they are cannot be conquered forever. The Igbo remembered their jubilees of freedom, their ancestral laws, their time of rest. The Ethiopians remembered their covenant, their kings who were priests, their mountains that echoed with sacred psalms. And together these memories form a bridge that defies time, a reminder that heritage is not linear but cyclical, that what was once lost can be reborn. In a world that thrives on amnesia, the Igbo and Ethiopians stand as living archives of a history too vast for colonial ink. They remind us that history is not owned by those who write it, but by those who live it. Their claim of Israelite descent is more than a historical curiosity. It is an act of resistance. It is a declaration that Africa's story is not a footnote to someone else's scripture. It is scripture in its own right. And in that declaration, every African can find a mirror, the power to reclaim, to reconnect, and to rise. So when we speak of the Igbo and Ethiopians as the keepers of ancient Israel's flame, we are not speaking of fantasy, we are speaking of faith in memory, faith in ancestry, faith in the truth that refuses to die. The world may analyze, dispute, and theorize, but the heart of a people knows. The Igbo know, the Ethiopians know, and through them, Africa remembers. For as long as there is memory in the soil, the truth of who we are will never vanish. It will only wait for the right generation to awaken it once more. The story of the Igbo and the Ethiopians is not only a tale of historical curiosity, it is a revelation of how ancestral memory can breathe life into a people's spirit even after centuries of exile, fragmentation, and forced amnesia. The path of ancestral memory is a sacred journey that neither begins nor ends in time. It is not written only in books or carved into monuments. It lives in the blood, the rhythm, and the consciousness of those who dare to remember. For the Igbo and Ethiopians, this remembrance became their shield and their compass, a spiritual code that survived when empires rose and fell, when colonizers drew maps that tried to erase who they were. Their link to ancient Israel is more than genetic or historical. It is a spiritual remembrance that has guided their moral compass, social order, and resilience through the ages. In the Igbo worldview, memory is not passive, it is power. Every story told by an elder, every proverb spoken in the market square, every ancestral ritual performed under the moonlight is a form of resistance against the silence that colonization tried to impose. The Igbo understood that to forget is to die, and so they remembered in symbols, in Nsibidi, in their 4 market days, in their sacred naming of the Creator as Chukwu, the source of all life. They did not need books to prove their descent. Their lives were the evidence. Likewise, the Ethiopians carried their heritage not as myth, but as identity. Their priests preserved the gaze language. Their kings guarded the legend of the Solomonic bloodline, and their people maintained customs that echoed the law and faith of the ancient Hebrew. This unbroken line of memory created a living bridge across centuries, a bridge that even foreign rule could not burn. The world often looks at such claims with skepticism because it measures truth by documentation rather than continuity. But in Africa, continuity is the document. The Igbo and Ethiopians teach us that ancestral knowledge does not need external validation. It is proven through survival, through the unyielding transmission of customs from one generation to the next. The memory of Eri, the Igbo patriarch, who came from the east, was not written on scrolls but carved into the hearts of his descendants. In Ethiopia, the memory of Menelik and the Ark of the Covenant was preserved not as fable but as fact in the spiritual consciousness of an entire nation. These memories remind us that truth can live in silence longer than it can in ink. The path of ancestral memory is not just about lineage, it is about the reclamation of dignity. When a people remember who they are, they rise above the narratives that enslaved them. For too long, Africa was told to forget, to look to foreign lands for its origins, its wisdom, its gods. But the Igbo and Ethiopians refused that command. They turned inward back to the soil that bore them, and in that soil they found their history. Their memory became a rebellion, a defiance against the colonial idea that Africa's story began with chains. By remembering, they proved that Africa's history began with kingdoms, scholars, prophets, and warriors who carried the light of civilization long before Europe awoke from darkness. To follow the path of ancestral memory is to understand that history is not a straight line, it is a circle. The Igbo knew this through their festivals of renewal, their ancestral rites that honored the living and the dead as one family. The Ethiopians knew this through their ancient feasts, their chants that united heaven and earth in sound. Both peoples lived in harmony with this eternal rhythm. What was, still is, what is, will be again. This circular view of life made them indestructible because it denied the possibility of final loss. Even when the Igbo were scattered across oceans, even when Ethiopians faced invasions and drought, they believed that everything lost in time would return in spirit. It is no coincidence that both the Igbo and Ethiopians clung to symbols of light. The Igbo celebrated the rising sun, a symbol of rebirth, of divine presence, of new beginnings. The Ethiopians held to the ark, a vessel of covenant, a reminder of divine promise. Both are emblems of continuity, of divine heritage, of faith in something greater than empires or borders. These symbols carried the same message across centuries, that no matter where the children of Africa are taken, the covenant of memory cannot be broken. The deeper meaning of this connection lies in what it reveals about the African soul. It shows that identity is not bound by geography or time. The Igbo and Ethiopians embody the truth that Africa has always been interconnected, spiritually, culturally, and historically. Their shared link to ancient Israel is a symbol of Africa's unity, of a time when the continent moved as one, guided by wisdom, law, and the rhythm of the ancestors. When we trace their traditions, we uncover not two separate stories but one vast African chronicle of endurance. This continuity is what colonial systems tried to shatter because they knew that a people who remember their past cannot be enslaved. To walk the path of ancestral memory is also to heal. The descendants of the enslaved and the colonized carry invisible wounds, the pain of being told that their history began in bondage. But when the Igbo and Ethiopians declare their ancient roots, they are not merely claiming prestige, they are reclaiming wholeness. They are saying, we were never empty, We were never lost. We were never inferior. Their connection to Israel becomes a metaphor for rediscovery, not to become something foreign but to realize that the sacred has always been within them. This realization transforms pain into pride, confusion into clarity, and fragmentation into unity. Ancestral memory does not dwell in the past. It demands action in the present. It calls upon every generation to become a vessel of remembrance. For the Igbo, this means reviving their ancestral laws of truth, justice, and equality that once governed their clans. For the Ethiopians, it means preserving their ancient languages and spiritual traditions amid modern times. For all Africans, it means rising to reclaim the rhythm that once made the continent a light to the world. The path of ancestral memory leads not backward into nostalgia, but forward into rebirth, a rebirth rooted in knowledge, dignity, and unity. The Igbo and Ethiopians stand as living witnesses to what happens when memory becomes destiny. Their customs, their names, their unyielding belief in their divine origin are not relics. They are key. They unlock a future where Africa no longer needs to borrow its identity from outside but draws it from within, from the rivers, the mountains, the proverbs, and the stars that have always told her story. The path of ancestral memory, once hidden beneath centuries of conquest, is now opening again. It calls the children of Africa, those in the homeland and those scattered across the earth, to walk it together, to remember, to rebuild, and to rise. For in remembering who we were, we finally become who we are meant to be. The story of cultural resurrection among the Igbo and Ethiopians is not a mere chapter in the pages of human history. It is an anthem of survival, a living example of how remembrance itself can become a weapon more powerful than any sword. Across centuries of oppression, invasion, and manipulation, both peoples held on to their ancestral memory as though it were breath itself. They understood that the true danger of colonization was never the gun or the chain. It was the slow erasure of identity, the rewriting of truth until a people began to doubt their own reflection. Yet through the storms of conquest and forced conversion, the Igbo and Ethiopians proved that memory cannot be buried. It can be silenced, it can be mocked, but it cannot die. It finds its way back in language, in rhythm, in the rituals of daily life, whispering the eternal truth. We are still who we have always been. For the Igbo, cultural resurrection began not after colonization but during it. When the British dismantled their traditional systems of governance, replacing sacred elders with warrant chiefs, they thought they had broken the Igbo spirit. But what they did not understand was that Igbo's strength was not rooted in political structure. It was rooted in collective memory. Even when their villages were burned, their shrines destroyed, and their ancestral symbols mocked as pagan, they continued to pass down songs, proverbs, and sacred teachings through generations. They built invisible altars in their words, encoded knowledge in their festivals, and protected their history in the rhythm of their drums. The colonizers may have claimed the land, but the spirit of the land remained Igbo. Cultural resurrection was already taking shape, not in open revolt, but in quiet defiance. Ethiopia, on the other hand, had never been conquered by any European empire, but it too endured constant attempts to redefine its story. Western scholars questioned its ancient claims, belittled its texts, and tried to diminish its legacy as the cradle of the oldest Christian and Judaic traditions in Africa. Yet the Ethiopians remained unmoved. Their mountains became fortresses of memory, their priests, guardians of knowledge. They guarded the Ark of the Covenant not only as a physical relic but as a symbol of covenantal endurance, a sacred reminder that even in a changing world, the spirit of divine heritage would remain untouched. Their resilience was a mirror to the Igbo's quiet rebellion. Both peoples refused to let outsiders tell them who they were. Both understood that heritage is not a costume to be worn for approval. It is the very soul of a people. Cultural resurrection begins with recognition, the awareness that something precious has been buried. When the Igbo began to reconnect with their ancient scripts like Nsibidi, when they revisited the sacred meanings of their market days, Iki, Ori, Ofor, Nakwo, they were not merely reviving art or anthropology, they were reclaiming language, rhythm, and time itself. They were taking back their right to name the world in their own tongue. Every symbol revived, every forgotten story retold became a strike against historical amnesia. It was an act of liberation through memory. For the Ethiopians, this process was embodied in their preservation of Ge'ez, their ancient liturgical language. While empires rose and fell, Ge'ez remained a sacred tongue, echoing across centuries as proof that Ethiopia's identity could not be colonized. The power of cultural resurrection lies in its quiet persistence. It is not loud or violent, yet it transforms nations. The Igbo did not wait for permission to celebrate their traditions again, they simply did. Their dances, masquerades, and festivals became acts of resistance, expressions of divine continuity. Even after decades of oppression, when they declared the Republic of Biafra, they did not create new symbols, they resurrected ancient ones: the rising sun, the red earth, the black shield, each representing rebirth and strength drawn from ancestry. It was more than a political statement, it was an invocation of memory. Similarly, Ethiopia's triumph over colonial aggression at the Battle of Adwa was not only a military victory but a spiritual one. It symbolized the survival of an ancient civilization that refused to bow to foreign definition. When Haile Selassie stood before the world, he did not speak as a ruler of a modern nation but as the voice of a lineage stretching back to Solomon and Sheba, a living embodiment of resurrection through remembrance. The lesson these two nations teach is universal: freedom without memory is hollow. A people may gain independence but remain enslaved in mind if they have forgotten their origin. The Igbo and Ethiopians demonstrate that cultural resurrection is the truest form of freedom, for it liberates the soul before it liberates the land. To resurrect one's culture is to declare that history belongs not to those who write it, but to those who live it. The British may have written the textbooks, but the Igbo wrote their truth in spirit. The Western historians may have doubted Ethiopia's claims, but the songs of her highlands still carry the voice of her ancestors. The world can deny a people's history, but it cannot deny their endurance. This resurrection is not nostalgia, it is rebirth. The Igbo and Ethiopians are not trying to return to the past, they are reviving its wisdom to heal the future. Through language revival, traditional education, and cultural festivals, they are teaching their youth that identity is power. The Igbo are rediscovering the philosophy of Igwebweke, the idea that unity is strength, while the Ethiopians continue to uphold Tafahito, the principle of oneness. Both philosophies express the same truth, that survival depends on collective memory. When individuals see themselves as threads in a larger ancestral fabric, they cannot be torn apart. The colonizers once thought they could erase African memory by erasing African languages, but they failed to see that language lives in more than words. It lives in rhythm, gesture, and silence. When Igbo women sing lullabies that echo ancient proverbs, when Ethiopian farmers recite chants before harvest, they are performing acts of remembrance older than any written record. These are the foundations of cultural resurrection, acts so simple yet so powerful that no empire can suppress them. It is through these everyday rituals that identity reawakens and dignity is restored. What both peoples achieved and continue to achieve is not just the preservation of heritage, but the resurrection of self-awareness. The Igbo rebuilt their communal structure after the Civil War, reminding the world that no defeat can kill a people who remain. The Ethiopians too emerged from years of internal struggle with their faith and language intact, their sense of continuity unbroken. This kind of survival is more than historical endurance. It is a spiritual victory. It proves that memory, when protected, becomes immortal. Cultural resurrection is not about perfection, it is about perseverance. It acknowledges the scars of colonization and slavery but refuses to let those scars define the story. The Igbo and Ethiopians show that heritage is not a relic of the past, but a living current that flows into the future. Every generation must guard it, nurture it, and adapt it without losing its essence. When children learn their true names, when they speak their mother tongues, when they wear their traditions with pride, they are participating in this ongoing resurrection. It is a process that never ends, because memory never dies. In the end, the power of cultural resurrection is the power to transform pain into purpose. The Igbo and Ethiopians remind the world that even in the face of conquest and oppression, the spirit of a people can never be extinguished. It can be suppressed, it can be forgotten for a time, but the moment it is remembered, it rises with unstoppable force. That is why cultural resurrection is the highest form of freedom, because it is freedom born from truth, not granted by any rule. And that truth, once awakened, becomes eternal. The Igbo live it, the Ethiopians embody it, and through their stories all of Africa learns to rise again, remembering that identity is not what history gives us, it is what we choose to remember and protect. The African covenant of unity is not merely a dream or a poetic thought, it is the call of the ancestors echoing through time, a whisper that rises from the soil of Africa and speaks directly to the soul of her scattered children. It is the reminder that before borders were drawn, before names were changed, before tongues were divided, Africa was one breath, one rhythm, one divine covenant written not on paper, but upon the heart of every man and woman born of her soil. This covenant is not of politics or treaties, it is of spirit, of shed blood, of a memory too ancient to be erased. It began long before the names Igbo or Ethiopian was spoken. It was born when humanity first looked upon the rising sun over the Nile and knew that the Creator had given this land a sacred purpose to be the cradle of wisdom, the fountain of civilization, and the eternal witness of divine truth. In the story of the Igbo and the Ethiopians, that sacred bond reveals itself again and again, not by coincidence but by destiny. The Igbo, with their deep reverence for the ancestors, for justice, and for the unseen power that dwells in all things, mirror the spiritual discipline and ancestral continuity of the Ethiopian people. Both remember, in different tongues but with the same soul, that they were chosen not for privilege but for endurance, to carry the memory of the first light of creation. They are the living proof that Africa's covenant is not broken, only forgotten. It lies waiting beneath the noise of modernity, beneath the weight of imposed religion, beneath the scars of colonization, waiting for its children to remember. When the Igbo speak of Eri, the ancestral patriarch who journeyed from the east, they are not just recounting migration, they are revealing the spiritual thread that ties them to that eastern flame, the same flame that burns in Ethiopia's mountains and temples, the same fire that once blazed in the land of Cushite. The Ethiopians trace their own descent to Solomon, to a wisdom that married heaven and earth, spirit and governance. What joins Eri and Solomon is not geography, but purpose, the remembrance that Africa's strength is divine order. Both stories affirm one truth, that Africa was entrusted with a covenant of unity long before the world knew division. And though this covenant was betrayed by centuries of slavery, colonization, and internal conflict, it still lives in the pulse of the continent, calling her sons and daughters home. The African covenant of unity is therefore not a myth, it is a mirror. It shows that the scattered tribes, the divided nations, and the forgotten histories are not fragments but parts of one sacred whole. The Igbo and Ethiopians remind us that Africa's greatness does not lie in imitation of others, but in remembrance of self. The more Africa remembers, the more she rises. When the Igbo rebuild their ancestral altars and rediscover the wisdom in Omanala, when the Ethiopians preserve their liturgical language of gaze and continue to chant songs older than empire, they are not looking backward. They are summoning the power that once made Africa the teacher of the world. The covenant of unity is not about returning to the past. It is about restoring balance, harmony, and truth to the present. For too long, Africa has been taught to see herself through foreign eyes, to measure her worth by foreign standards. But the covenant of unity whispers otherwise. It tells her that her worth was sealed before time began, that her civilizations were born from divine breath, and that her wisdom was never lost, only silent. When the Igbo and Ethiopians remember their connection, they are not just remembering each other, they are remembering every African soul, from the banks of the Nile to the forests of the Congo, from the deserts of Mali to the shores of the Atlantic where ships once stole her children. That remembrance is resurrection. It is the moment when the scattered rise from the dust and recognize themselves as one body, one spirit, one destiny. The covenant calls for a rebirth, not the rebirth of nations as the world defines them, but the rebirth of consciousness. It demands that Africans everywhere begin to see through ancestral eyes again, to understand that the power of unity is not political but spiritual. It is the unseen thread that makes one tribe's freedom the freedom of all, one people's wisdom the inheritance of all. The colonizers knew this. They understood that if Africa remained united in memory and spirit, she could never be conquered. That is why they divided languages, religions, and kingdoms. They taught the Igbo to doubt the Ethiopians, the Ethiopians to see themselves apart from the rest, and the rest of Africa to forget she was one family. Yet even in the heart of that darkness, the covenant endured. It endured in the rhythm of the drum, in the sacred chants, in the mother's lullaby, in the rituals of harvest and burial. It endured because truth cannot die, it only sleeps. Now in this age of awakening, that truth stirs again. The scattered children of Africa, from the diaspora to the motherland, are beginning to hear the ancestral call. The Igbo see their symbols echoed in the Caribbean. The Ethiopians recognize their rhythms in the Americas, and suddenly, history begins to realign itself. This is not coincidence, it is prophecy unfolding. The African covenant of unity is awakening, urging her children to return not just to land, but to identity, to memory, to purpose. It is calling for the creation of a new jubilee, a time of remembrance and reconciliation, where every African tribe, tongue, and diaspora community stands together and proclaims that they are one lineage under one ancestral spirit. This covenant does not demand uniformity, it celebrates diversity as divine design. Just as the Igbo and Ethiopians each preserve different aspects of the ancient truth, so too does every tribe hold a fragment of the whole. The covenant asks that those fragments be gathered, that the wisdom of each nation be shared again, that no culture be shamed or forgotten, and that the sons and daughters of Africa recognize that the enemy was never each other, but the lie of separation. In unity, Africa reclaims her strength. In remembrance, she reclaims her crown. The covenant is also a call to heal. Centuries of division, war, and misunderstanding have left scars on Africa's body, but healing begins with truth. When the Igbo teach the world that their ancestors came from the East, and that they once knew the laws of the Most High before any missionary arrived, they are not seeking superiority but restoration. When the Ethiopians declare their unbroken heritage from Solomon and Sheba, they are not boasting, they are bearing witness that Africa's covenant still lives. Together they form the two witnesses of memory, one that remembers through endurance, and one that remembers through preservation. And between them lies the bridge of unity, a bridge that all of Africa must now cross. This covenant is not something to be signed or negotiated. It is to be lived. It is lived when Africans honor their ancestors, when they teach their children the truth of who they are, when they create art, music, and philosophy rooted in the soil of their own spirit. It is lived when they stop seeking validation from the world and begin building a world of their own rooted in dignity and truth. It is lived when they look upon one another not as strangers but as reflections of the same divine ancestry. In this awakening, Africa will not need to prove her greatness, she will simply remember it, and as she remembers, the world will remember too. The African covenant of unity is the return of the first light, the rebirth of the spirit that once guided kings, prophets, and healers across the continent. It is the whisper that says, "Rise, for you were never defeated, you only forgot." When the Igbo and Ethiopians rise together, in remembrance, in pride, in unity, they become the fire that rekindles the soul of Africa. That is the covenant's purpose, to gather the lost, to heal the divided, and to remind the world that Africa was never the dark continent. It was the hidden sun waiting to shine again. And now that sun is rising.